Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Quantum Bridge with myself, Casper, as ever with my co-host, Gary, and really pleased to say that we have yet another new guest, which is always just excellent to have new people joining us and new perspective. So rather than rabbiting on, I'll pass across to Gary. Please introduce our guest and let's hear what he has to say.
Indeed, yeah. I'll also try not to rabbit on, although there is a lot to say about Michael, really, who I met via X, and I've been following his account for a little while, mostly around these stories around Egypt. I think is when I first saw him. There's an interesting travels and escapades in that part of the world, which, if we get time, we'll cover today. If not, maybe Michael will join us again and go through that. We've also got interesting things. There's also a walk-in. If you're not familiar with that term, we did another show with Franco Romero, actually called Walk-ins. So you could see that. But we also hope to hear Michael's story himself at some point. But to get it going, welcome to the show, Michael. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing quite well.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll just start with when I walked in. I walked in at age 11. I'm not someone who walked in and I'm a different soul. I'm basically the same version of myself. It's kind of when I was 11, I had a rough childhood, and the other Michael basically was at a breaking point and said he wanted out, and that wish was heard, and so I came in, and that was quite a tumultuous entry, because the other Michael's vibe was so low at the time that it made syncing extremely difficult. And so my first experience coming in was 2 weeks of equilibrium, complete disarray and disorder. I actually had, so from a child's perspective, I was at the time a sixth grader, and all that I knew was that out of nowhere, I couldn't walk, couldn't do anything for myself. I had to crawl. I had an upstairs bedroom at the time. I had to crawl downstairs. I would stay on the floor of the living room basically all day. My mother would bring water and food to me and then would have to leave for work. That lasted for about 2 weeks. It lasted long enough that I thought it wasn't going to end, which was quite frightening, as you can imagine.
Michael, at that time, is this something you've become aware of later, or of what was going on there? Did you just think, well, I'm ill at that point, or was you aware of the situation?
At that point, well, because when you come in, of course, all your memories are erased. So at that point, I didn't know. I came in as far as I knew, I was Michael at the time. And it wasn't until much later in retrospect that looking at why am I so different from everyone else, that I put pieces together, and I came back to this moment of those 2 weeks of disorientation. And at that point, I'd been on my spiritual journey long enough to put pieces together and figure out that, I was a walk-in. At the time, I definitely did notice that there were things that were different about myself, and was curious. I would have thoughts like, humans are so strange. Why do humans act like this? And so, and I would know, well, I would think to myself, well, why am I thinking of humans as something other than what I am? And, I'd be confused by my own thoughts in that way, but then just dismiss them and go about my day. Because of course I was in school as like a regular kid, as anyone else was at the time. And then let's see, for the most part, I had, what I would consider to be a regular high school type experience. And then after that, I ended up joining the Navy, which in retrospect wasn't the best decision, because of course, when you go to boot camp, the first thing that they do is they break your spirit, which is, they have to in order to get you to respond to orders you wouldn't have otherwise, go into danger, and go against human nature and those sorts of things. And having been through what I was through, where I didn't have that perfect alignment when I came in, that ended up causing problems for me. And essentially that caused holes to develop in my aura. And that that basically opened me up to the world of spirit without knowing what was going on. And at the time I had figured out that, and this goes back a little bit to childhood when I walked in. One of the difficulties that I had as a 12-year-old when I first came in was thinking that I could do things, thinking that I had abilities, and not being able to make them work and not understanding why they didn't work. That was another factor that I came back to, knowing that I was a walk-in later on in life. So then going back to the service, I ended up getting sent to a very dangerous ship, and I worked in the engine room on an aircraft carrier. And it was a pressurized steam system. So you got pipes all around you with 720 pounds per square inch of steam, and it's very dangerous. And in fact, the only reason that I was sent to that ship, the reason that there was a spot open, was because they'd had a steam explosion, and there was someone standing right in front of it who put up his arms, had all the skin cooked off of his arms and everything. So that's why I was sent there. So you can imagine that's not the best environment to have for your first command for the Navy, but that's where I went. And there were a lot of catastrophic events and near catastrophic events where, you shut down equipment right before things explode, or things have steam leaks or oil leaks. And so you're constantly in this area of danger. And what that does is it causes your stress and your anxiety level to never drop below like a 4. Every day you go in and you know that something could happen. And there were times that the things did happen. And one of the things that confused me at the time and was quite startling was I ended up finding out that I was immortal when I was there, because things kept happening, exploding, or danger kept happening right next to me, things that ordinarily would have killed other people, but something would happen right at the last moment to where I would survive. And essentially a good way to put it was a statistically impossible number of circumstances kept happening to me. And like I said, things would happen to make it so that I didn't die or wasn't catastrophically injured, and I had no explanation for it. And to give one example of that, there was an incident where we had water in one of the steam pipes, which wasn't drained out like it was supposed to be. And the steam was sent down the pipe. And when that happens, that's called water hammer, which is essentially a big slug of water hits every corner in the pipe at about 60 miles an hour. And it's like a big rock. And that's usually how you get major steam leaks and, people die and that sort of thing. So this water hammer was sent from the boiler across to the engine room to a turbine that I was standing right underneath at the time, and slammed into the turbine. And we're told at school that water hammer equals instant death. And it's drilled into you enough that to get you to avoid those type of circumstances. And so when it happened, the sound of it is just boom, 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 as it goes across the engine room, slammed into the turbine that I was standing right underneath. And my first thought was, why am I not dead? And I ended up frozen in that moment of knowing that I should run for the exit, which was behind me, except my job is to make sure that the turbine is offline so that whatever happens doesn't kill everyone else. And also I realized I'm not going to make it to that back exit. The exit I have to go for is the one towards me, or towards the front of the engine room, which meant I had to run towards the turbine that was exploding as it was exploding, which was a moment that ended up sticking with me for the rest of my life. That moment of indecision where I had to think about, I should run this way. No, wait, I have to run at the thing that's exploding. That moment was something that stuck with me. Well, it still sticks with me. But I did. And when I got up the stairs, because I was on the lower level below it, when I got up the stairs, I found out that the upper level man had been standing right next to it when the water slug hit the turbine, and fortunately had been there just to flip the little trip and flip it off the line. And a few weeks later, when we took it apart and we were going to fix it, because it basically destroyed the turbine, I took apart this thrust bearing, and the thrust bearing on a turbine is what's supposed to keep the spinning wheels from moving into the ones that aren't spinning, because otherwise it just shreds it and explodes, and that's how everyone dies. And on a thrust bearing, there's this little bit of lead that's supposed to serve as a cushion, and that bit of lead had been smeared like butter when we took it apart. And what's supposed to be about 1/4 of an inch, the only thing that was left is a little smear that you can barely even see, like a little wisp that was burnt of smoke. So my friend Curtis had tripped it offline with basically a fraction of a second left before I would have been dead. So that was interesting to see, as it was physical evidence to see this on this piece of this bearing, this wisp of lead that was left that showed basically how much time that I had to live. And that was kind of a piece of physical evidence that I was immortal. And that was a big changer for me, because before I had all these ideas of like, well, maybe there's something different about me, or, why do these things keep happening to me? And why do I keep surviving these things? And here was proof, physical proof of all these ideas that I'd had in my head that to that point were just ideas.
It's reminded me of that movie with Bruce Willis. Can't remember that. It's someone will say it in the comments. I bought it again.
Unbreakable, I think.
Unbreakable. There we go. Yeah, that's what just popped into my head. Yeah, or an empty void of it. Yeah. So at that point, I mean, was that enough to make you leave the Navy? How did that come about?
No, actually, I didn't leave, and the main reason why I didn't was because it was very important to me to see things through, and a lot of that, I guess, it was important for me to prove to myself that I could make it through no matter how bad it got, I guess, which maybe there's some self-destructive tendencies in there, or something along those lines. But that I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it, because most of the other guys were handling it. There were guys that left at the time. What people would do is they would go home, usually for Christmas leave or something like that, and they would smoke pot or do some other drugs, and then when they would come back to the ship after Christmas break was over, they would self-report themselves and say, "Oh, I smoked pot," and then they'd be discharged shortly after that. And that's not without consequence, because then you get an administrative discharge, and those are at the time anyways, very hard to turn around. It ends up being an albatross that you carry around because you served in the military for 3 or 4 years and didn't leave with an honorable discharge. So that was one of the other reasons I stuck around, is I didn't want to have that difficulty. And there ended up being a cost for that, because just to go through it real quick, shortly after that, the ship had a lot of problems. It was in the shipyards in Long Beach, and we were the last ship to leave Long Beach before the shipyard closed down. And because of that, some of the shipyard workers started sabotaging the ship because they didn't want it to leave. And we couldn't leave until the engine room was up and running. And so they would do it in ways that weren't going to necessarily cause danger to people, but, all of a sudden, oh, here's this gauge that's just missing, or, the starter for a pump is just gone. And those things, you can't get one overnight. In some cases they were custom made or whatever. And so these things kept happening again and again. And eventually we left the shipyards just to leave. And what ended up happening was the ship was due to deploy in 1996, shortly after that. And it was very important to the government and to the Navy that happened. And so what they did is they decided to essentially lock us down for about 9 months. And the pretext was that all this repair work had to get done on the engine room, but they actually called in contractors to do all those things. And so what they were doing was, they ended up telling us at some point that what they were doing was, we were there as insurance, so that the ship didn't make deployment. They could say, well, look, we had all these guys stay on board and we didn't even let them leave for like 9 months because they were working so hard. So basically, we were an insurance plan to cover the butts for politicians and other people if the ship didn't make it. And in fact, several months into this, if you spend enough time on a ship like that, we were in port in San Diego, so you can go outside and see the sun and the beautiful weather, but you can't leave the ship. And it ends up being prison, and everyone goes stir crazy, and people turn on each other, and it kind of ends up being a Lord of the Flies thing. And there were some severe psychological consequences for everyone. Everyone that I served with basically back then has had some sort of problems with depression and other things that were related to that. And there were other things that happened too. My best friend, his marriage and life ended up spiraling largely because of that, and he ended up taking his own life in 1996. And it was a very difficult time. I ended up having a lot of anger and resentment related to that. And part of it is that you do end up, as you had mentioned, you had asked me if I had stayed in the military after that. And I ended up having to forgive myself for staying, basically, and putting myself through that and through those 9 months. And it actually wasn't until about 2 months ago that I was able to release a lot of that. I went to see a spiritual healer, essentially, who works with the subconscious mind. And he ended up finding that I still had this resentment buried deep inside of me, this anger that needed to be set free. And he helped me to do that. And I've had a world of difference since then. Because essentially I'd done a lot of work, shadow work, if you want to call it that, on my time in the military, and had largely made peace with it. But I still had the roots of this anger inside me that I couldn't get rid of. I knew it was there, but I didn't know really what it was from. To me, it was just, a feeling of resentment and maybe darkness that I couldn't get rid of. I didn't know how to.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I feel like that sometimes. I think, well, I've done a lot of, like you say, shadow work and things, but then you just feel there's you get stuck sometimes, I guess. And maybe that's where I don't often go to external help, but maybe I do sometimes. How do you feel about that? That people should seek other healers and things to help clear some of this stuff?
I did it on the recommendation of a friend who was quite insistent, actually, that and she had told me that actually that she had received messages from spirit that, hey, Michael needs to go see this doctor. This doctor can really help him. I didn't even really know what it was about. But I did it because I trusted that person and that person's messages more than enough so that I didn't mind that I had some questions or, wasn't sure about what the doctor, was going to be capable of. I basically did it to kind of entertain it and ended up having a transformative experience. And it was great with the doctor. He actually mentioned that he was able to help me set a few things free. And one of the things that he mentioned was that first visits don't normally go that well for people, that they aren't able to set so many things free. But it was because I'd done so much self-work over the years that those things were ready. And it was just the roots that were left that were ready to be taken out. Let's see. And then from there, starting around age 30, I started having what I would call shamanic visions. And they were quite frightening at the time. I was married and had a young son and 2 older stepkids. And all of a sudden I started having these incredibly vivid memories of my family being murdered in front of me, and then me being murdered, and horrific as you could imagine, and had no explanation for it. And at the time I thought it was related to my Navy experience, that it was a manifestation of PTSD coming out, but didn't really have any explanation for it. And unfortunately for me, I ended up going to a psychiatrist to take care of it. And as many people know, when you do that, you end up being put on the you end up with big pharma being the solution for everything. And what that essentially caused was it helped in the short term in the sense that I was able to function. I was working in IT work at the time as an analyst, and it allowed me to do my work mostly. But what it did was really it buried everything down inside me. And what I did was I coped basically by saying everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. And that was kind of, I had learned that from my parents. That was how they, coped with everything also. And as my IT career progressed, I didn't really know what was happening at the time because the medications that I was put on gave me an awareness problem. But what was happening to me was my metaphysical gifts were coming out. Essentially, all of the trauma that I'd been through in the military had activated clairvoyance and claircognizance and clairaudience to quite a significant degree. And I didn't necessarily notice them as much. To me, it was I just had a visual memory, was how I would describe it, and that I was good at figuring things out. That's how I, what I thought of with claircognizance. And since I was an analyst, it kind of all fit in. And also, my father is a fairly, in his field, he's a well-known computer scientist. He's a CGI pioneer, and he's the one who came up, along with other people, with the idea for the algorithms for open world gaming and all these things in virtual reality. He was a pioneer in that also. So kind of analytical minds and those sorts of things run in my family. And so I had normalized a lot of what was going on in my mind.
Michael, can I just jump in for a sec? Because I'm finding this fascinating, which is one of the rare times that I've shut up for more than two. So thank you. And thank you for being so open and candid with us and our audience as well. It's really appreciated. Just touching on that, I think probably I am picking up on things on a more subtle level than maybe sometimes I do. And I just wondered whether or not you might be coming to this, you may not want to touch on it, and either way is fine. But it feels like this is partly, you've just mentioned your father and you've touched on sort of your parents to some degree, although not necessarily what they made of that episode, those 2 weeks, where obviously there was massive transformation for you. Well, so much so it wasn't quite you anymore. But in terms of your lineage, have you thought about, felt any intuitive knowledge around anything to do with that having an effect on, obviously on your life? It's part of you, but has that aspect come to the fore at all for you?
Do you mean as far as if anyone else in my family has the same gifts that I do?
Yeah, and not just gifts, but experientially that they've had, and it doesn't have to be your parents by any means, but that you've even heard that back along your lineage somehow. And I don't even just mean genetic lineage really, but maybe that's too far to go off on at the moment, but that there's a reason. I mean, you can say there's a reason for everything anyway, but that you see a specific reason as to why. I mean, this is quite a lot of trials that you've had to go through. And, I tend to think that that's usually only given to those who, one, can on some level handle it, but secondly, who can alchemically transform that. And I just wonder whether you've pinpointed where you think some of this stuff may have originated.
Well, I know that as far as clairvoyance and claircognizance, my father has those gifts also. But he's not aware of them in the sense that he's not a spiritual person.
Right. Yeah.
Very much so, because having worked in IT for so many years myself, the way I describe it is it's the world of ones and zeros. And when you spend so much time learning and basically aligning your brain to think in those terms, it disconnects you from spirit very much so. And that's how I see my father and why he was the way he was, as far as not so much of a spiritual person. But he would describe sometimes that he would be in staff meetings and all, and that it would be frustrating for him because he could see exactly the way the staff meeting was going to go and who was going to say what next, and these sorts of things without an awareness of knowing that was unusual. That he had normalized these gifts within himself. And actually having that realization about him helped me to understand with myself that that's what I had done.
No.
But also,
Gary, by the way, Gary will really resonate with this because this is part of the sort of skill set or whatever you want to call it that he possesses that I don't seem to have. So he will definitely resonate with what you've just said.
Yeah, and the normalizing of it. I think when I was growing up, I would, like your dad, I'd sense some of these things, and I'd be like, no one else sees this, or and it was that sort of thing. I just thought maybe I'm just nuts, because yeah, he's like, you didn't notice that stuff, and I'm like, no. So it's weird, but
and it causes us to naturally bury our gifts. I know that I certainly did, and especially in the Navy, because so much of the military, you typically get people who are from the inner city or the trailer park or small towns where they grew up in very poor circumstances. And I came from a middle class town, so I didn't have that in common with many of the guys that I served with, but also because they come from those backgrounds, education isn't so important to them. So they typically, they tend to struggle more in those areas. And then here I came where I mentioned who my father was, and then I came from a really good high school. And then on top of that, I had these gifts that were blossoming especially when I was in the service and subject to all of that, the stimulation, we'll call it that, from all angles. And so when I would know things that I shouldn't know or see things that I shouldn't see and would bring them up, it would really stand out from the other folks. And so I learned to bury those things or to normalize them in a way so as to not be so much of the weird guy, because everyone for the most part has these feelings of, on a certain level, wanting to fit in. But to Caspa's point about all these things that I've been through, there is a reason for it, and a reason why I came in for that, and that's that, and why I had to go through all these things, and that's that I was meant to do the walk-in version of of Michael was meant to walk the path of return and help other people do it. And in order to do that, the path of return is paved with tears, basically. And so to make significant progress in a single incarnation, you have to go through a lot of pain and a lot of trials and get past them all in order to make progress. And that's why alchemists refer to a significantly difficult life as a lottery ticket, because if someone is able to turn that around, that they can walk the path of return.
It feels a very, very valiant role and mantle to have taken it on, and this whole thing of nothing worthwhile was ever forged in the crucible of comfort, and this definitely hasn't been I'm not saying that Gary and I have had particularly comfortable experiences, but this sounds profoundly tough. So sort of hats off really to what you've been through, Michael, and what you continue to do.
Yeah.
Thank you. It certainly has been difficult, to say the least, but and I didn't really have an inkling of why I was going through what I was going through until basically in my mid 40s. And but that's how it is for most people. You don't really have that understanding or that full awareness until that time of life.
There's something, a perspective that seems to hove into view. You may have had glimpses prior to that, and some people, of course, do come in and maintain full awareness, and that is maybe a wonderful thing, and occasionally maybe a very tough thing too. But yeah, I think there's a lot of beings out there at the moment who are coming into an understanding of what they are, why they're here, what their purpose is, and realizing that all of those struggles they've been through, particularly the last few years as well, have catalyzed in them this sort of level of gnosis, I suppose. It's fascinating, and I think I know that we'll be running short on time, but if you would consider it, that I often say we've barely scratched the surface, and of course we haven't at all here. And I'd love to dive more deeply into a number of those areas if you can find the time.
Sure,
Michael.
Yeah,
I'd love that.
Great.
Well, I'll touch on something else. I mentioned that I ended up getting.
We're going to run out, I'm afraid. Remember, I said the half hour would go quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we'll have a cliffhanger for next time.
Yeah. Give us a quick cliffhanger.
Sure. Well, a quick cliffhanger is I was troubleshooting software for many years in Silicon Valley. I ended up using my gifts to do quite well in IT. And I ended up having a major Kundalini zap in about 2014 that affected my memory and made it so that all of a sudden I couldn't do this work anymore. And the psychological medications that I was on, which were enough to tranquilize a horse. Well, just to give you one, 800 milligrams of Seroquel, which is something that they normally give to people as a tranquilizing dose. And I was working as a high-level analyst in Silicon Valley. And what ended up happening was my mind exploded and my subconscious mind became like a wild hose.
There you go.
And
That's it.
Right. Okay. Say no more. On that note,
okay.
we very much hope you come back, and thank you, Michael. That would really appreciate your time and openness.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciated it also. It's nice to meet you both.
Take care.